Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Roadmap. I'm your host Rach. This week we are in a different location and we have a different topic of conversation for this week's episode. And today it is all about design systems. So what are they? How do they work at Autotrader? And with me, I have a group of colleagues who actively work in the design systems that we have at Autotrader. So welcome to the show, Chris, Kevin, Lubna. Great that you could join us. So before we get into the topic of today, it'd be really great if we could just do a bit of a roundtable of who you are, what you do at Autotrader day to day, before we get cracking. So who wants to start?
Cool, I don't mind starting. I'm Chris. I'm a principal product designer. I work on the consumer side of Autotrader, so the main autotrader.co.uk website and the products that hang off of it. I've been here about 9 years, and one of my other focuses really is the ATDS, which is the Autotrader design system, which I guess is why I'm here.
I'm Lubna. I'm a tech lead, also in the consumer space with Chris. We work across a lot of the same kind of areas, but my main focus is kind of around the marketing, landing pages, content, basically everything that helps our users kind of research what car they'd like to buy, as well as any kind of events and things that Autotrader runs. I'm a returner, so I started at Autotrader in 2015 as a grad, was here for 6 years, then I left for 2, and then I came back last year. So unfortunately my count reset a little bit. So technically 1 year, but if you count the others, then I've been here around 7 with a little gap.
Oh, welcome back.
Hi, I'm Kevin, product designer. I tend to work a little bit across both spaces, so across retail space and the consumer space, so working with our trade customers as well. I've been here about 2 years, currently working mainly with the selling team, so on anything where somebody got a car that they want to dispose of, that's generally our team. And obviously I help out on our TDS, which is the retailer tools design system.
Awesome. So what is a design system?
Good question.
Where to start?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think for me it's a way of sort of managing design at scale. I think where it manifests itself to a lot of people is like a component library, and that's the things that designers and developers use off of the back of design systems. But I think it's a lot more than that as well. I think it's about like the documentation, the decisions, the reasons for how you got to those components, how people use them, how people contribute towards them, and all of the things behind that component library as well. Sort of systematizing the way in which you design and develop websites and products.
I did write a bit of a definition, so I'm going to read it so I get it right. But this is kind of looking at other systems and what other people say online and kind of combined with how we define it. But it's a collection of building blocks which are guided by clear standards and processes that can be assembled to build various digital products. So it's relatively vague, but the idea is that there's the building blocks, which are the kind of component library, I guess, but there's also the standards and the processes, and those are like really important to actually like make it a proper design system. So your standards are kind of like guides on when to use certain things, when not to use certain things, and the processes are of like how do you make changes, how do you introduce new things, how do you deprecate old things. They're the kind of more people side of the system, but I think that's the thing that's really important and potentially the more difficult part. But I think you need to kind of have all the 3 areas to make kind of a sophisticated system. Whereas if you like only have parts of it, you might find it falling over in certain areas.
Yeah, it's the evolving heart of the culture of the way that we work, I guess. That helps us keep consistency across customer experiences, and then it's also a source of truth as well, isn't it? Not just for coding for components, but it should encompass everything that helps us build Autotrader experiences. So whether it's content guidelines or brand guidelines and other things, it should be the hub where anyone can go to find anything they need to know to build an Autotrader experience that feels like us and gives the consumer a consistent experience.
Yeah. Kind of like a house, but like how you choose to decorate that house and make it personal. You choose how you see fit. You can get creative with it, but component-wise and fundamentally, those foundations never change. But you use that to inspire you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But, I don't know what the word is for it. Like, not a euphemism? I don't know.
Analogy,
that's it.
Yeah.
Awesome. So how did you all get into design systems? Because this is not your everyday kind of job. This is not something that you're all dedicated to 100% of the time, but it is something that, you know, you feel passionately about, and you do play kind of active, like, regular roles. How did you get to working on it?
I think for me, quite early on in my design career, just as I was starting to discover sort of web design and product design, I was quite interested in like learning a little bit about front end code and like what it is that my designs are built with. And I sort of got a real interest in both sides at one stage, and obviously took the design pathway. But I think fast forwarding in my career to when I sort of discovered design systems, it was that same realization then of like, here's a bridging gap between front end code and design that I really loved right back from the start of my career. So as soon as I learned that, and you know how efficient design systems can be and how much they can help other people as well as being like an interest of mine, I like instantly gravitated towards them, and it just naturally became like quite a big interest of mine. So yeah, I'd say that would be me.
Yeah, I think there's some similarities for me, and I think I've been kind of involved in design systems before they were called design systems, in that like before we were using things like React and stuff like that, which kind of is built in a way that makes reusable components very common. When we were just like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, like thinking of ways, how do we make the CSS reusable? How do you put some systems in place? Like no one wants to code the same button 20 million times every day. So kind of how do we do these things? Kind of starting with like SAS, maybe creating like mix-ins and just things that are then reusable through that way. And then as we kind of started moving towards using React, it's sort of like the code came together and it worked really well, where you could have more of like a component that's reusable rather than just a bit of styling. So then, and that's when the kind of term design systems kind of came about. And I think just as soon as, I think I went to like a conference talk where they talked about this kind of idea of a system. I think as soon as I heard it, I was like, this is what we've been trying to do.
Yeah.
And this is what it's called. And then I think just since then, I've just been really interested in it. And I think the thing that keeps me interested is almost that tension between consistency and kind of conforming to a system, but also allowing enough flexibility and creativity so you're not like stifled and everything doesn't just all look exactly the same. Yeah. And I think just finding that balance between the two, I think that's the thing that I find the most kind of like fascinating. And it's always just like an interesting conversation. It's like, oh, is that too limiting or is that too flexible? And just finding a nice middle ground.
So previous to starting at Autotrader, I had very little experience with design systems other than like building email templates and things for us to reuse and things like that, where I worked previously wasn't very digitally mature, I guess. But then coming to Autotrader, it was clear how much easier the design system made things, especially sort of from an onboarding perspective, and starting as a relatively inexperienced product designer, I guess. But it really helped me. But then it was also apparent that there were places where things could be better. So that's what inspired me to get involved and see what input I could have and what changes we could make.
Awesome. So why, I guess a lot of companies have dedicated teams or even product teams around design systems. Why do we not have one at Autotrader? And what's this concept of, this kind of being like an ongoing stream of work that you have governance over, but it's not a dedicated team? Like what was the decision behind that?
It's a good question.
I think I think part of it comes down to like we didn't want to limit it. So initially, because it wasn't like a thing, we were all just doing it because it made our lives easier. Like it made it easier to have reusable classes and things like that. So we just kind of did it and put some stuff together. It wasn't really like a thing. I mean, we called it a thing and we knew what it was, but it wasn't like something we talked about a lot, like to the wider business, sort of outside the dev community. But I think kind of when we started using it more often and more frequently, it was a thing that was kind of in the industry that people were hearing about, and we made it like an official thing. It was still sort of side of desk a little bit, and only relatively recently we've decided to kind of come together in like a governance group where we can kind of look after kind of where it's going and just be there to make any kind of top level decisions. But we also wanted to keep it so that everyone could contribute, because we don't want to kind of gatekeep it of like, we are the design system team and it's like, if you need something, you tell us and we'll kind of do it. We want to encourage people to get involved, to contribute, but still have kind of a layer of that, you know, making sure that the right things get added and kind of have those conversations and keep the comms and the process and things like that, because I think that's where you really need to kind of look after it. But another thing as well is we've been trying to not treat the design system as a product and actually treat it more as like infrastructure. I think that kind of works a bit better, because usually a product kind of gets finished and it gets kind of into maintenance mode, but the design system is never really finished. We're always using it, always evolving it. So it's kind of more as part of our infrastructure that supports all the other products and apps and things that we build. And so it needs to have like that continuous input and and just have people kind of working on it and looking after it, even if we're not doing any big initiatives, just to kind of make sure nothing starts to kind of stray out of line and kind of break anything.
Yeah, I suppose like because we've never had a dedicated design team for the design system as well, there's probably a question mark over whether we need that or whether we could continue and build on what we've started on, which is like Lubna mentioned, like with a special interest group. Now that's sort of grown, I suppose, to be a wider group of people in the governance group, and whether we can solve the problems that a dedicated team would have through that group as well as like focusing on our projects as well. So I suppose it's not to say that maybe that will ever, like, it's not to say that we'll never necessarily have a dedicated design system team. I suppose it's more of a question of whether we need it or whether we're already doing that job with the governance group that we have today.
Yeah, like if it's working fine, then why attempt to fix something that doesn't need that attention? And I think you raise a really good point as well, because I think by having a shared community where you feel like you can give feedback, like you said, you're not gatekeeping. Anyone should feel like they've got feedback for it, or that if they've got an idea, nothing is off the table. But that kind of day-to-day, just making sure that it gets overseen is still really important. So I think that's a really good way of looking at it. How, I guess, because this is something that you've all kind of evolved over time, and Lubna, I believe you were there from the beginning as well. How did you take it from that initial concept of this is something that I think we should be doing as a business to, okay, this needs to matter to the company? Because this feels like a major thing, like a huge thing that's been very beneficial to a lot of people in the business. But how did you take it from that initial concept to making it matter to others?
It is a difficult sell, isn't it? Because like Lubna mentioned, it's not a product where there's a deadline and there's a finish date and teams can move off onto other things. So it is, and sometimes it can be hard to quantify the benefits of design systems as well, because we can all say, yes, we feel like it's making us way more efficient, but how do you quantify that in business terms? But I think some of the things that have sort of brought it to the fore is like building inconsistencies and things like that, where we are maybe building bigger products and we're more aware of how we show up to consumers as well. And just like we all know what it feels like to work here as a forward-thinking tech company. And it's making sure we're communicating that to the I guess to the wider consumer community, and that we're not just the magazine anymore, because I think there is still that view from some people that there's a lot of people that would say, "Oh yeah, Autotrader, I remember the magazine."
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just communicating that we are who we are. We are a forward-thinking tech company. So.
Can imagine as a consumer as well, there probably are a lot out there that might have bought a car when it was the magazine, and then they're thinking about the new car now, and they're like, hey, there's this website and it does all these things. So yeah.
I wasn't I wasn't there necessarily in like selling the concept of a design system to the company, but I guess it could be pitched in different ways to different like disciplines and roles and responsibilities across the company. So like for some people, like the efficiency and the speed in which you can create new things and maybe ship new products might be an attractive benefit to some people. Obviously to designers, there's a consistency piece, and to developers as well. There's obviously a way of working thing between designers and developers. So I suppose it's taking the benefits of a design system and pitching the right ones to the right people as well. I suppose if you're looking to like create or propose the idea of a design system when you don't have one, I'm guessing some sort of element of that may have happened in the past to get to where we are now.
Yeah, I think the consistency and the ability to kind of move a bit quicker, especially, it's like it won't apply to everything, because like sometimes you'll have a product which is quite specialized, which might not really be fully from the design system because you have a special component that's only used in that place. It's very specific. It's very logic heavy, for example. But then when you have like content pages, especially, like it makes so much sense. Like if we have an event coming up and we want to make a page, like a landing page for it on our website, we now don't have to spend like weeks and weeks designing it, figuring out the colors and where it goes. We can just look through our design system and kind of pick the elements that make sense, put the content in, and we can have that page done in a couple of days. So it just makes it a lot faster for those kind of pages. But I think that's the thing to just keep in mind, that it is a balance of like those pages will move fast, which is great because it means you can like react to things a lot quicker. Like if you wanted to spin up a page for a certain event or something kind of to hook into. But then similarly, when you're also doing anything that's product specific, that way it kind of gives the designers and the devs, just lets them focus on the more complex and more interesting problems, but it will still feed you things like colors and all that kind of stuff, so you don't have to worry like what color should this background be, what should this button be, because you already know, you've already figured that out. So now you figure out the kind of complexities in logic.
Like thinking about the solution, everything else, like component wise, it is there for you, and it just gives you that creative freedom to think about, okay, well, I need to serve this need for a user, or I need to do an A/B test, which is something that we do quite regularly here. And if it took us weeks and weeks to get to a design decision, everything would just take years to do. So yeah, it's definitely beneficial.
Yep.
Awesome. So we are a two-sided experience here at Autotrader. So we've got people that sell the cars, so our sellers, our dealerships, who actively work in their own tools that we provide to them. And then we've got consumers who every day they're on the website and they are doing what they need to do in order to buy a car. Because of that, there are two different design systems, and we did touch on it earlier, but what is the difference between both of them, and fundamentally what do they do?
So we've got ATDS, which is the Autotrader design system, and then we've got RTDS, which is the retailer tools design system. I suppose, like at the root of it all, we've got two design systems because they're on two different tech stacks, and I suppose the output of them is different. One's obviously very tool based and is there for our customers in retailers, and the other, I suppose, the output is for a broad set of users in anyone, I suppose, for serving like the Autotrader website and its products. I think it's worth noting, like, although they are separate design systems for those reasons, there's like an active like consideration for us at the moment to make sure that we are communicating between the two design systems, and that we're sharing sort of like at least at a foundational level as much as possible, so that, like, I suppose we're not making decisions around the same sort of thing in two different spaces. So like coming up with the same solution for something twice, two different routes. Like we're making sure that we are fundamentally sharing as much as possible between them, but the output above that is different.
Yeah, we have different goals, don't we? From a user perspective, the two spaces have different goals. RTDS, what focuses on the retailers, is very very task oriented, and it is a tool for people to do the things they need to do to run the business. So whether that's managing stock or setting prices or gathering data and analysing the business performance. So we're serving those needs as opposed to ATDS, which is, I guess, more brand and more experiential and consumer focused. But like Chris said, although we have different user goals, we are trying to align as much as we can do, because we're trying to solve the same problems as design system teams. We are trying to solve the same problems in that we're trying to build a community where everybody sees the value and everyone can contribute, and we're trying to improve communication as much as we can between design and dev and get that shared language. And it just makes sense, obviously, because we're quite a fluid company and people move around from project to project, and somebody might be working in a consumer space and then working in a retailer space. As much as we can keep consistency across the way the design systems work, that makes it easier for people just to transition from one to the other.
And I think on the tech side, as Chris mentioned, we do have two different tech stacks. So our consumer kind of Autotrader.co.uk website is in React, whereas the retailer tools are written in Angular. So from that point of view, we would need two separate sets of components and things, just so obviously they work within those spaces. But we also do have our native apps team, and there's a sort of a variation of the consumer one at the moment. We're looking at how can we kind of bring that in. So we are kind of more similar, at least again on those foundational levels of kind of like colors and typography, because their components would also need to be in the native languages of the apps. But kind of the more we can share, I think, the better, and the more kind of similar the approach, the easier it'll be to scale long term, just like across the business.
And I guess similar to the native apps service as well. So that is becoming more of a thing. And there is a separate episode on this if anyone wants to give that a listen. And it goes into a lot more detail. But I think that absolutely helps us in our day-to-day job, that everything traditionally that you do on a website, if there is an app version, you have to then go through an apps team who specifically have those skills and that particular kind of language knowledge to be able to build the feature and replicate that. And then you got to think about releases and all that kind of thing. And the native app service absolutely helps us with that, where it just helps you adapt and you can do things a lot more quickly.
Similar.
So it's all built up. Yeah. Awesome. Do you find that there's different or similar challenges across the retailer, so portal space, where they've got their own tools and components, and the consumer space, or do you think there's separate ones? How do you kind of navigate that?
I think there's probably quite a lot that does overlap, but I think one of the things that comes to my mind in terms of like a challenge that is probably more in the ATDS space than the RTDS space is when we are challenged with coming up with, I suppose, I don't want to say creative components, but components that sit outside of the remit of the design system. So, for example, if we wanted to run like a marketing campaign or create like a more unique standout landing page, sometimes I suppose the design system can feel like, because of its like roots in consistency, that it's not serving the purpose for those pages. So there's a challenge in how we have more challenges in how we manage like people that want to like divert from the system, and how we manage that, and how do we like keep records of that and keep it like, I suppose, communicated to like the wider design system community.
We definitely get less of that with our TDS, and there's less brand consideration. So we've been working through colours and tokenization and what we name our colours and how we work through all of that. But we've definitely got less to consider than ATDS, I think, and less in terms of components and patterns as well, I think, because ours are all built from maybe smaller components, whereas ATDS has got a lot more to try and communicate. Like I say, we're very task focused, but
I can imagine at a forecourt, someone who is selling a car, they just want to get the job done in the easiest way. And in any online website that you have where you've got consumers, it's all about conversion and how do you get consumers to make that right decision. So you can definitely tell there's different use cases for each, and it's how you kind of adapt around that. So yeah, I can totally see that.
There'll be different needs. Like there's lots of dashboards and graphs and things in RTDS, because obviously dealers need to know kind of how's their stock doing, whereas we don't have as much of that on our side. On the kind of consumer side, we do have some occasional graphs here and there, but it's very kind of minimal, so it's like really easy to understand. Whereas obviously to a dealer, like they know their business inside and out, they know all the graphs and things. So I think it's just the slightly different considerations, and so therefore sometimes there'll be some use cases that we have that RTDS just won't need, and then vice versa.
Awesome. So it's not just a component library, so it's not just a place that anyone can access and they're like, okay, yeah, I'm just going to check this out and use it. I think breaking the perception of that, what does it mean for everybody involved at a tech company? So particularly here at Autotrader, why should it matter to everybody? And how do you make it more than that as a system?
Yeah, so I think like it's so easy to fall into the, I don't want to say trap, but like it's so easy to fall into like just looking at it from the standpoint of that this is something that I use and the part that I use is the component library, and that like there's a huge part of the design system which is documentation and reasoning, and I think it's just about like I suppose communication and making sure that people that are using the design system are also aware of that documentation and they know that there's a centralized place where that's held. Similarly, I think it's good to sort of adopt a culture where, like, although you might be using the component library for what it is, it doesn't necessarily mean that like it ends there. Like there's a whole like area of like contribution and like challenging what's in the design system, and coming up with new things that might be considered as new patterns and things that we store within the design system as well. So it becomes something that I suppose you don't want it to be just a tool that people use. You want it to be something that people learn from, use, challenge, and feed back into the system, and then it becomes
like a cycle.
A cycle of
I guess optimizing it all the time.
Yeah, and I think part of it is just about that perception as well. In a similar way to how like everyone who works at Autotrader in one way or another kind of represents the company, like if you're giving a talk or something like that, like you're sort of representing it, and our message tends to be pretty consistent in kind of like who we are and how we work. That a design system also needs to kind of do that for a brand. That's why I think it's important for everyone to be involved in that, because everyone needs to know that it exists and kind of what its goals are. And I think that helps with that whole overall perception of coming across as one kind of like unified business. But also just kind of build some trust with the users as well. Like if you go on a website and every single page looks completely different with completely different colors, you're probably not going to buy anything from that website, just because you'll think, oh, this is a bit dodgy.
Like the teams just don't work together in the background. Like why do they not have? Why is everyone in a silo?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's such a crucial part that we need to make sure. But with such a large website, it can, like, I don't know every single page that's on Autotrader. So that's another reason why I think it's important to get everyone involved, because like then if someone sees something, it's like, oh, this maybe, did we forget to update this, or is this page doesn't look quite right? They can bring it up because they'll know that there's a design system. They'll know kind of roughly what it should look like. I think that's a really important thing. And then we kind of build more advocates for it as well throughout the business if everyone sees the importance of it.
How do things go from because you've mentioned the whole like learning, so everything comes from learning, and there's logic that gets put into place when you put the components into the library. How do you decide on these things? So where do you get that logic from? Is it that you research it? Do you test it? How do they become like part of, I guess, the furniture of the design system?
So it's something that we're working on at the moment, I think, is making our contribution model more detailed, I suppose. But I suppose loosely we have some sort of fundamental rules in that if you're creating something for, I suppose our contribution works a bit like a decision tree. Like if you're coming up with a new contribution for the design system, I suppose it's a it's asking yourself the question of like, is there something in the design system that already serves this purpose? If so, is it an improvement to an existing component? And if so, why? And that could be something that comes out of design critiques. It could be something that we've usability tested or got feedback on, and it becomes something that we all deem as an improvement with evidence or with opinion. If it's not something that's within the design system already and it's something completely new, we then sort of go down the tree of like, is it something that we think in the short term is going to be reused in multiple places? Yeah. If it is, then that's definitely something we want in the design system, because we believe our design system should be full of components that we know are going to be useful time and time again. However, if it isn't going to be something that's reused, it then becomes a unique instance. So it's something that, I suppose, and this is something that we're sort of learning now, is that we want to track those unique instances, but we don't necessarily need them within the design system until they become something that other people need in different spaces. So it's a bit of a decision tree is our contribution model.
Yeah.
Currently.
It's also a bit of the learning curve, isn't it? Like you said, it's something where we have introduced new things and moved away from the design system a little bit recently. But then that's proved successful and popular, and that's then feeding back into the design system, and there's other places picking those things up. And these are sort of new challenges, I guess, aren't they? That we haven't got everything figured out just yet, but we are, whilst working on these things, we're trying to define those processes of, like Chris said, how do we go from a unique instance to something being part of the design system? Yeah. So hopefully we'll get to a good place with processes for that.
I think the power is in the data as well, because if you launch things and it is a little bit different and you feel like it's a one-time thing, the more you learn from users. So we have things like Clarity, where we can learn through recordings, and the research team. I think the value there is in the data that we have that makes it become part of the system itself.
Yeah, because I think we try to keep our experimenting to the products. Yeah. Because obviously, like, if you think of your design system as like a house and your foundations, you don't want to be experimenting with your house foundations.
Yeah, like, I'm just going to paint this wall blue and just,
So I think what we try to do is, like, if we have an experiment or a use case where we think, actually, we're going to need a new thing, or we want to change a thing, then we try to do the experiments within the products, because that's going to get us all the data of like, do people kind of interact with it more, and is it better? And then it's more of a just kind of, once we've done that experiment, if it's gone well, then we start to think about, okay, now how do we feed it back and kind of expand it to be everywhere? And I think that's the important thing as well, because I think sometimes you can kind of get into that, we'll just experiment a bit in the design system, but I think it's important to keep it as stable as possible. Yeah. And so, like, we try to have that separation of experiment in the products, and then once the experiment is successful, bring it back to the design system, especially if it's something kind of core. Obviously, like Chris said, if it is a kind of a unique instance, then we might just kind of make a note of it, that there's a unique instance of this over there. Yeah. But we just need to keep an eye on it in case there's another one elsewhere that is similar. And then we start to think of, like, okay, are they similar enough? Do we bring them together and put them into the design system so that they can be used in both places?
Yeah. I think Deal Builder is a really good example of that, where, because it's quite a brand new product. And again, we have done an episode on this. If anyone does want to get more information, you can listen to that. But yeah, Deal Builder, so it allows a consumer to reserve a car online, and there's all these checkpoints within that journey. And the idea is you reserve that car with the option to add part exchange and finance in your home delivery if you want to, and it's completely flexible. But because that's quite a newish product, I think it's a couple of years old now, which is quite new to Autotrader, because we have been going for many, many years as a website. And I think that was something that we discussed when we were prepping for this episode, that actually it is a space where some of the components feel a little bit new. They feel a little bit like slightly different. But I think we've started to learn, as someone who works as product lead in that space, we are starting to learn through the funnel and the interactions that we get, that at some point this is going to be a decision where we make that as part of the design system. So that feels like a real life kind of, it's an in progress thing at the minute, where there's decisions that we're still making about that, about whether we bring that into the design system or we adapt.
Yeah, I think Deal Builder, I didn't work directly on Deal Builder, but I think it was an interesting space because it was such a large focus and such a large product to be working on. It almost became, I think at the time, like a little bit of a sandbox for how we push the design system forward a little bit more. So I think at the time we were quite concerned that like our design system, like how do we move it forward? How do we like stop it from stagnating, I suppose. So I think Deal Builder, with the focus it had, became like an experimental place for pushing, like, I suppose, the emotive side of our design system a little bit further. And then that became like something that we then considered to feed back in. I think the most notable one would be like our buttons. We've sort of created like I suppose like a small theme that we called Comfort. And that was, to serve the purpose of being a more emotive journey for consumers going through that car buying process online. But on reflect, like that was like a sandbox that then informed some of the updates that we made to our design system, and I suppose still does a little bit.
So we started kind of bringing that in. So like the button is a very good example because we recently released it across the whole website. And that was one of those things where the design system really helped, because we kind of had this sandbox area where we experimented with it. It worked really well. People were really happy with it. And then it was just kind of trying to think, now, how do we kind of feed this back and roll it out through the website? So it ended up being, there was a few areas where we had to check because the size of the button was a little different. But on the whole, having the design system and being able to make that change there and kind of cascade it out through all our front-end apps made it so much easier than if we had like the kind of old school monolith of code and having to go through and try and find all the pages that had a button and update, and we'd miss some inevitably, just because it always happens. And so it would have just taken like months and months, whereas this took, we were able to do it within a week. And that was just mainly kind of like one person going through all the apps and just doing the updates. So it was relatively painless and straightforward. So and it was a good experiment as well, because it was like one of those large scale changes that we hadn't had a chance to do through our design system yet, which has also given us a bit of confidence to know that we can do that going forward with other elements as well.
Yeah, it's those things from Deal Builder that is where we're now trying to define those processes for how we update the design system, isn't it? Because there's things that are being reused within different journeys, and we've recognised, okay, well, this is a problem that Deal Builder's already solving. Let's try and keep consistency across the site and across our various products.
From, I guess, a design angle, what's been the reaction to the design system? So you're both actually active members of the design community. You are designers here at Autotrader. What's been that reaction?
Just generally having a design system.
Yeah,
I think the opinion of, like, speaking broadly on behalf of the design team is that, like, I think people do get value out of the design system from the component library that we serve within Figma, and I think there is a case for having documentation that we have today, and that being useful, but it probably, as an improvement, would be better for our designers if it was more accessible. But I think the general opinion is that it works, but there's like known improvements that we could do in terms of like contribution and documentation. But it does help in terms of like designing and testing like products.
Yeah, definitely. I think those are some of the problems we're trying to tackle as well, trying to improve how easy it is for people to contribute and how easy it is for people to make changes, and where we store documentation. We're experimenting with storing design documentation within Figma on our TDS at the moment, because it means designers can just jump in and make changes without any need to consult with sort of dev on that. And it is just trying to make those improvements in how well it's embraced. And like Chris said, I think everybody does definitely see value in it, but it's just making it more accessible.
How do you get that balance as well, where you've got this system and you don't want to limit design's creative freedom, but how do you strike that balance?
Yeah, it's really tough, and you don't, I suppose, being someone involved in the design system, you don't want to sort of become like the design system police in a way. Like, you want to like designers, a good design system, in my opinion, should always allow for creative freedom as well as like offering the consistency and the benefits that a design system brings. I think where we're getting to and what we're learning is that, and it goes back to the stuff I was mentioning around like the unique marketing pages and unique instances, is that if we have like a really tight, rigid foundations layer, so if we have our spacing, our color palette, our typography in a really good place, we should be able to allow designers more flexibility to build things using those foundations layer, because if they're using them and they're that well built, it should feel cohesive, and it should feel like whatever gets built using them should feel part of Autotrader and part of like the wider, like it should feel like it's been part of the design system anyway. So I think I think next steps for us is like, how do we allow and like how do we make our foundations support more creative freedom, but then how do we then manage that and like stop a scenario where we have like everyone build something that's a unique instance, then like how do we manage that? I think that's how it feels.
Documentation plays a big part as well, doesn't it?
Yeah,
because that gives people guidance on how to do things. We don't need to specify you must do this and the spacing must be this, and we don't need to lay out every page and explain to people exactly what that should look like. It's more of these are the colours you should be using. We should be using primarily this colour. This is how many, like we should have just the one primary CTA on a page, and this is where we normally sit the other CTAs. And it's giving, I guess, that groundwork and those plans, but allowing space in between those things for the designer to design and push things a little bit.
Yeah, I guess similar to like tech world as well. Like if you had a code base where everyone's just put their thinking in there, it becomes a bit of a mishmash. So I guess having those principles in place allows for you to do the fun stuff, really, like coming up with the solution.
Yeah, and I think from the dev side as well, it's I guess a little bit less on the kind of from the UI point of view, but similar to like functionality, even like if you have two things that maybe they look different but have a very similar functionality, it's kind of like, do you put them together? Do you have them separately? And just trying to think of it, because obviously the more things you put together, the more complex it becomes, because it needs to figure out which one am I. So I think we also have to kind of keep that in mind as well, to kind of, there's the UI aspect of we want things that look the same to be the same thing, but also if two things look the same but function differently, kind of like, are they still the same thing, or are they a different thing? So I think that's one where we kind of sometimes can potentially have some crossover on and be a bit unsure. And I think there are some components where we've maybe made the decision that was right at the time, but then as it grew, it wasn't the right decision anymore. So it's kind of just going back to some of those and figuring them out. But like I said, I think it's a very interesting challenge of and I think that's why it's good to have like a bit of a community around it as well, because then you can challenge each other, like what you think makes the most sense in your mind. It's like, of course, this is the way to do this. Someone else might come along and go, actually, did you think of this thing? And then you might not have thought of it. It might be so much better, or vice versa. Maybe it's not a good idea, but you talked it through. So then like when they see your implementation, it's not going to be like, oh, why did they do it like this? Like they should have done it this other way. Because you've had that conversation. So you know exactly why it was done in a certain way, which I think is like the key thing, I guess, in documentation. Again, just to figure out why things were done. I think that's the most important part.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think you can channel the creativity into being new contributions or considerations for the design system. So it can be that you are more creative, and you're free to run like with some of the components that we have and change stuff and build new things, so long as it becomes a consideration that it can go back, or potentially can be flushed back into the design system, or the design system can update as a result of that exploration. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, awesome. So what is the future like for Autotrader when it comes to design systems?
I think I probably jumped the gun a little bit before talking about like refining our foundations, but I think that is a real focus for us at the moment, especially within the governance group. I think we're looking at tightening our foundations, obviously because they are the widest spread thing that we have in our design systems. They are like the fundamental like pieces that make all the components and that we build components with. It's making sure that we've got them in a really good place and that they're rolled out in as many places across site, and just making sure that it's working at the best it can be. One of the focuses for us at the moment is looking at our design system tokens and structure. So like, how do we build our foundations in the best way? And that's again something that we're sharing at the moment between ATDS and RTDS. That's an example of how we're sort of working together and making sure that we're not creating two sets of tokens for two systems. We are actively communicating and making sure that there's overlap where there needs to be.
Yeah, because I think we had to look through our design system because it's a reasonable size and it's reasonably well used in most places. And like, there wasn't anything hugely wrong with it, but we just spotted like some gaps and things, like Chris said, like potentially some of the foundations. And I think we're just, now that it's a few years old and it's a bit more matured and we know kind of more of the use cases, which can be hard when you're starting out because you usually build for one use case. So it's like you built it perfectly. But then when you start using it in other places and you start kind of hacking it a little bit, that's when you kind of start to spot all the gaps. So I feel like now that we have that knowledge, we can make an informed decision of where the gaps are and how to solve them. So one of the gaps potentially is the foundations. We're trying to think of naming in particular, like how do you name something in a way that's meaningful and makes sense, but isn't so limiting that it's literally used for just one thing, because then it makes it pointless. And then in a way that also it can change, like if your colors change, shades of colors change, like how do you make it so that it's easy to change that, but like it still makes sense and you don't have to go and find all the instances of it and rename it. I think that's one interesting challenge that we're trying to solve, because I think if we solve that, then we can make it really scalable and just kind of give it a much longer life. So that's why we're kind of starting at the foundations. But then I think the plan is to kind of work through all of our layers and just kind of make sure all our components are in a good space. Obviously, it'll take quite a bit of time because as we update, we have to kind of keep in mind where they're already being used and if it's going to like break things, and kind of try and manage it and make a bit of a plan of how we roll things out. But that's kind of what we're working on, basically. We've got the design system, it works. Now we're just trying to kind of shore up any gaps and make it even better.
Elevate
so kind of to keep evolving it. And I think that's probably how it will be long term as well. So hopefully we'll shore up most of the gaps, but new products and things come out all the time.
There'll always be something new.
So there'll be something that we hadn't thought about, so we'll probably have to revisit. But I think that's the exciting part, that like just keep having to solve the little problems that come up.
Awesome.
I think ATDS and RTDS are in different places. RTDS is the older of the two design systems, but probably didn't get a huge amount of love for quite a while. But we're focusing on very similar things, really, in terms of we're working through our foundations and then from there rebuilding components, some of which may have lived in Figma for quite some time. So things like auto layout and responsivity are baked into them. But it's those things. So we're working through the foundations, working through tokenizations, which, as Lubna mentioned, brings massive benefits in terms of updating things and making changes and getting those layers of naming, whether it's base tokens or semantic tokens that allow us to make changes either to individual products or sweeping changes across the system. And for us, it's rebuilding those foundations and working through the components. But then also one of our main focuses or principles that we set out when we started working on it was around usability, and just trying to improve that culture of contribution and how everybody sees the design system. So
I'm looking forward to seeing what the next year looks like for you all. Brilliant. That is all we have time for this week. Thank you very much for joining me on this week's episode. Don't forget to like, rate, follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts on YouTube and Spotify.